Good evening, everyone. We're so happy you're here. Welcome. Thank you for joining us this evening for the most recent installation in our lectureship, our Endowment lectureship series here at Congregation Emanu. I'm Rabbi Oren Hayon. I'm so happy to have the chance to welcome all of you here to this space to learn together. Before we introduce our speaker for the evening, I just want to take a moment of welcome and thanks and acknowledgement to express our gratitude for all of the organizations and the individuals who helped make this evening possible. Tonight's lectureship comes as the result of a partnership between Congregation Emanu and the Bondic Institute and the Jewish Federation of Greater Houston. Very grateful to our friends and partners in those three organizations and those other organizations. Also very grateful to the donors, underwriters, and sponsors whose generosity and philanthropic tzedakah helped make this evening and all of our endowment lectureships possible. Their names are listed on the back of your handout. I hope you had a chance to look at that on your way in, so you know who to express your gratitude to help make this helping make this evening possible. Our speaker this evening is about to be introduced to you by Dennis Bram, so it's a pleasure for me to invite Dennis up to help tee up this evening. Before Dennis, who is the chair of the board of the Jewish Federation, makes his way up here, just another word of thanks internally to the team here at our congregation who helped facilitate this evening, to Jason Plotkin, our program director, and the entire clergy and staff of our congregation who helped make this and all of our learning opportunities possible. So thanks to all of you for making this happen. You see note cards coming around now for your comments and questions later on in the evening. And so, without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Dennis up to the bima. Dennis?
Thank you, Rabbi. It's always a pleasure to be here, not only to have our Federation in partnership with the Bondic Institute and the congregation here, but the congregation here is such a leader of so many things in our community, from Yom Limud to Jewish education and working closely with our Department of Jewish Education. So I can't thank the congregation enough, and Rabbi and all the spiritual leaders that we work with here at Emmanuel. So thank you. So we are really pleased to be a co-sponsor of tonight's event. We have a very special relationship with the Joint, JDC, the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, which continues to be and has been for many years a key recipient of community dollars through the Jewish Federation, as well as nationwide through the Jewish Federation system. The relationship literally goes back 100 years as historic partners with the JDC and the Jewish Federation system, where we have locked arms for so long to work together to save Jews around the world. In Houston, we have a very special partnership with the JDC. We allocate significant resources each year to ensure that they can continue their vital work. Their leadership, their professionals work very closely with our professionals. We partner with them across the globe, and with the help and guidance and leadership of the JDC, there are lots of community missions that go from Houston around the world, bringing members of our community to see the work on the ground of the JDC, notably, and in recent years in Buenos Aires, very recently in Cuba, and coming soon next summer to Kiev, and to St. Petersburg. And I might note that I'm very proud that we have so many leaders in our community who are national board members and leaders in their own right on the national JDC board. So it makes it particularly pleasant and enjoyable for us to be part of this program tonight and to be an introducer of our speaker. So our speaker, Will Recant, is the Assistant Executive Vice President of the JDC. He's responsible for its international development programs. And before joining the JDC, Will served as the Executive Director of the American Association for Ethiopian Jews, where he advocated most strenuously and successfully on behalf of the Ethiopian Jewry movement. The story you all know. The end result was his efforts on behalf of Operation Solomon, one of the largest resettlement efforts of the 20th century, and one in which our community, again, was involved as a significant participant. In his work with the JDC in Argentina, he played a key role in the international effort to shore up the Jewish community there during some really tough times for the Jewish community during their national economic crisis. And if you travel to the Jewish community there, you will see the special role that our community, along with the JDC, has played in building especially the new home for the elderly in the midst of that economic crisis, saving lives, helping Jews at risk, helping seniors. Will has developed Jewish renewal programs across the former Soviet bloc countries. He is an expert in the former Soviet bloc. He holds a master's degree and a PhD in political science from George Washington University. His doctoral dissertation focused on the difference between Soviet Jews who made Aliyah and those who emigrated to Israel, to North America and Europe. And for those of us who are so active in the Soviet Jewry movement, we can remember the debates about Israel or North America, or do we just simply help to get Jews get to freedom? And he has been in the thick of that, contributing his life's work to saving Jews. So please give a warm Houston welcome to Dr. Will Recant, who will speak on rescue, relief, and Jewish renewal. Dr. Recant.
If I were standing here 12, 15 years ago, I'd be telling you the story that Dennis just recounted of the economic crisis in Argentina. I'd be telling you that of a community of 250,000 Jews, 65,000 fell below the poverty line within a 2-month period. And if I were here, 15 years ago and said to you, where in the world is there another Jewish community that looks and lives and is a mirror image to you? I would have said, come down to Buenos Aires. Reform, Chabad, Orthodox, conservative congregations, Jewish community centers, day schools, the full gamut of Jewish life. What would happen here if the banks closed and you had no access to your funds for a 10-month period? That's what happened on December 31st, 2001 in Argentina. The banks closed. People had no access to their funds. So the Joint Distribution Committee went to Argentina, started to work with the Jewish community, and took care of them. If I was standing here in the early 90s, I'd be recounting to you the story of Operation Solomon, the dramatic airlift in which 14,192 Ethiopian Jews were airlifted to Israel in the midst of civil war, in the midst of a desperate situation. We didn't lose one soul in that rescue life. We gained one because there was a baby born on the flights from Ethiopia to Israel. If I were here in the 1970s, 1980s, I'd be reading you a list of names. Anatoly Sharansky, Yuli Edelstein, the Jews of silence, the refuseniks, the Jews in the former Soviet Union who wanted freedom, who wanted to practice their religion, who wanted to be able to go to the United States or Israel or wherever they wanted. If I was here in the 1950s, I'd be telling you, we at the Joint and the Jewish people need your help in Israel. The Ma'barot, the tent cities that were constructed for the Jews from the Maghreb, from all of the Arab lands, Yemen, Tunisia, Morocco, Libya, Egypt. More than 1 million Jews who had come to Israel didn't have enough. There wasn't enough housing for Jews in Israel. They lived in tent cities for years. If I was standing here in the late 1940s, I would be telling you that it's the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee that's running the displaced persons camps, where the remnant survivors of the Holocaust got their first pair of shoes and their first hot meal. If I was here in the 30s, I'd be telling you about various rescue attempts, some successful, most not, that we made in East Europe and in Germany trying to get Jews out. And if I was here 101 years ago, I'd be reading a cable from the United States ambassador to Turkey, who was a Jew. His name was Morgenthau. And in 1914, he was in the Ottoman Empire, and he went to check on the condition of Jewish communities living under the vast Ottoman Turkish Empire. And in 1914, Ambassador Morgenthau made his way to pre-state Israel. He went to Palestine, and he met with the Jewish chalutzim, the pioneers who were pioneering the land of Israel. When he got back to his office in Istanbul, he sent a cablegram to the largest and wealthiest Jewish community in the world at that time, to New York, and it basically said, can you raise $50,000 and form a joint distribution committee from all of your religious movements and all of your different organizations in North America that will raise the $50,000, form this committee, bring that assistance to Jews in need in Palestine, and then go out of business. 101 years later, I stand before you as a representative of the Joint Distribution Committee, commonly known as the Joint in more than 70 countries around the world. The mission of the Joint, unchanged for the past 100 years: rescue, relief, and renewal of Jewish communities outside of North America. Rescue as large as Operation Solomon, getting the Israeli Defense Forces to fly planes in and bring 14,000 plus people to Israel. Or as small as this year, or last year in 2015, the need to help rescue 130 Jews from the war zone of Ukraine. Moving Jews in a war zone today from Donetsk and Lugansk and having to bring them to safe zones and safe houses in Kiev, where you're going to go and you'll see them, and in Dnepropetrovsk and elsewhere in safer areas of Ukraine. Relief tonight, through the federation system which supports the Joint Distribution Committee, 140,000 elderly Jews throughout the 11 time zones of the former Soviet Union are given assistance through the Joint. These are elderly Jews who have to face the decision every day of, do I buy food or do I buy medicine? There's not enough for both in my meager pension here in the former Soviet Union. And it is the Joint that the Jewish people throughout the former Soviet Union and Eastern Europe have to turn to for assistance. The fun part of the work is the last one of the R's: rescue, relief, renewal. Renewal is fun. Renewal is working in a place like Sarvash, Hungary, where we run a summer camp for nearly 3,000 children from throughout Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union. And for many, it's the first place that they have a Jewish experience. It's the first place that they, as Jews, are able to come out and be together. And it's these young kids that come through Sarvash and come through the camps that we run who are leading a renewal and a rebirth of Jewish life in Eastern Europe and elsewhere. Best story of renewal, and the one that hits closest to home for me, is the story of Cuban Jewelry. In 1990, well, let's take a step back. The revolution took place in 1959. At that time, there were about 15,000 Jews who were living in Cuba. 90% of the Jewish community left Cuba between 1959 and 1964. In Cuba, they had developed a wonderful community. They had synagogues. They had a Jewish community center. There was a kosher deli in Old Havana that was called Moshe Pipik's in the 1930s and the 1940s. And in the 1950s, the community built a beautiful synagogue and community center. But by 1964, the communist regime had come in. They declared atheism officially as the religion of the country. They never closed down a synagogue. They never closed down a church. But as long as atheism was formally considered the religion of the country, anyone who was ever seen walking into a synagogue or into a church was not a good atheist. If you're not a good atheist, you can't be a member of the Communist Party. If you're not a member of the party, there's no way of advancing academically, socially, economically, or any other way. So even though the government never closed the synagogue, the community just stayed at home. The last rabbi left in 1964. There hadn't been a Jewish wedding or bar bat mitzvah since 1964. And in 1992, the government of Cuba changed its constitution and said, oh, we're now not an atheist country. We're now officially just a non-religious country. I was working for the Joint Distribution Committee in Washington, D.C. And, the first three numbers that we teach our kids or grandchildren, 911. In case of emergency, this is what you call. The Joint is the 911 of the Jewish world. And when there was a change in the Jewish Constitution, the president of the Jewish community of Cuba, Dr. Jose Miller, called the Joint and said, help us. And JDC called me and said, oh, you have a PhD in political science. What's the difference between being a non-religious community or being an atheistic community? To which I said, I don't have the slightest idea. And I called the State Department, and I called the Office of Latin American Affairs and asked them what the distinction meant. They didn't have the slightest idea. And Dr. Miller called from Havana and said, I'll tell you what the difference is. The difference is now that we're just a non-religious country, you can walk into the synagogue again and be a member of the party. So Dr. Miller is saying, I need you and the Joint to come and help us reclaim the Jewish community. I went to Cuba. The Joint was the first organization to get a license from the United States government to travel to Cuba and work with our Jewish co-religionists. Went to Cuba in 1992, was in the basement of the community center / conservative synagogue. Upstairs in the sanctuary, there were birds nesting over the Ark, over the Aron Kodesh. Every window was broken out. And when I went upstairs to what was the women's section, my leg went through the ceiling because it was rotten and termite infested. Dr. Miller helped pull me up, and we went downstairs. I went on a Friday night to attend services with the Jewish community of Cuba in 1992. We were in the basement of the community center. The room, probably about this size. The place hadn't seen a coat of paint since the 1950s. None of the light bulbs were working. It was August, it was hot. And we were downstairs, and there was a sign on the wall. And it said, Am Yisrael B'Cuba Chai. The Jewish community of Cuba lives. And I stood there with Dr. Miller, who was 72 years old at the time, and waited as 6 other members of the community showed up for Friday night services. And I leaned over to Dr. Miller, and I said, Emes, true? Am Yisrael B'Cuba Chai, the community lives. It's you and 6 octogenarians. And he said, no, it's not true. We are dying, and there will not be another generation of Jews in the country of Cuba. Fast forward to just 6 years ago, Dr. Miller passed away 6 years ago, and I was with him during one of the Federation visits, one of the community visits. I think it was from a federation in Florida. And I was standing with Dr. Miller in the same spot in the basement of the Patronato, which has now been completely renovated, completely refurbished. No more birds nesting over their own Kodesh, no more broken windows. The basement has air conditioning in it. The community has a Shabbat chicken dinner every Friday night that's sponsored by the Joint and by the Federation system. And I leaned over to Dr. Miller and I said, "Do you remember when we met some 12 years earlier?" And he said, "Yeah, I remember. And I remember exactly what I said to you. And thank God, and thanks to my community, and thanks to the Joint, I was wrong. We have come back, we are thriving, and we're doing as well as we ever have in our history." So I've gotten to witness a Jewish community literally rising from the ashes. In 2001, I had the privilege of bringing my 13-year-old daughter on one of the community missions to Cuba. And while we were there, we went to Friday night services, and by now there are 500 people who show up every Friday night for services at the Patronato and at the 2 other synagogues in Havana. And my daughter said to me, "I speak a little Spanish. Is it okay if I just sit with the kids in the community instead of you old people from the mission?" "Yeah, fine." She then comes up to me during the Shabbat chicken dinner. Here's a quick diversion. Shabbat chicken, well, I'll come back to this, but my daughter said to me, "I sat with 6 kids from the community who are between the ages of 12 and 14. And they told me there hasn't been a bar bat mitzvah here since 1964. I told them I was having my bat mitzvah in a few months and asked them if they'd want to do it again. And they each said yes. So my daughter says, "Dad, what will it take to have B'nai Mitzvot in Cuba again?" And I went to the JDC resident director, Diego Friedman, and said, "Diego, what will it take to train these kids to have bar bat mitzvahs again?" And he said, "Let me think about it." He came back and he said, "Okay, for $600 per kid, we can train each one to read Torah, lead services, and we can give each one a Tanakh, a Sidur, tefillin, a talis, candlesticks, and we can have a party for the entire Jewish community of Cuba, because this is really the bar mitzvah of the entire community." My daughter came to me and said, "I'm going to get some money for my bat mitzvah. I want to sponsor these first kids having B'nai Mitzvot in Cuba." There have now been more than 100 kids who have had B'nai Mitzvot in Cuba. Literally got to see the renewal of Jewish life. I've had the privilege of seeing the best and the worst of human behavior, and as it applies to Jews and non-Jews. And when I say the best of human behavior, it comes in going to Kosovo. If you remember, the Serbs were bombing the Albanian Muslims living in Kosovo. More than 1 million Kosovar refugees going to Macedonia and Albania in 1994 to 1996. And then, the refugees, NATO began bombing the Serbs. And all the programs for all the humanitarian and relief organizations were to set up winterization programs for the Kosovar refugees that were in Macedonia. After NATO began bombing the Serbs ran away from Kosovo, and the refugees weren't going to stay in a refugee camp for a winter. They started to go back home. And we walked into Pristina, Kosovo, with the Muslim refugees as they were returning home. And we sat at a UN meeting, and the best of human behavior was sitting around the table with Catholic Relief Service, Lutheran Development and Assistance, Adventist development, other faith-based groups, and us representing the Jews. And we were all sitting around the table talking about what it's going to take to rebuild this country and rebuild the educational system and everything else. It was a wonderful, wonderful moment. Worst human behavior was in Somalia during the time of Black Hawk Down, going to a Somali refugee camp that was on the Ethiopian-Kenyan-Somali border, and going with a preconceived notion that Jewish doctors and nurses from the United States wanted to volunteer and come into the refugee center and provide assistance to the Muslim refugees from Somalia. We got to the camp, we flew into this dirt airstrip, a large refugee camp, where there were 49,200 refugees. Catholic Relief Service was in charge of taking care of the refugee camp. In the middle of the camp, there was a large tent with hundreds of children. The children were all laying on the floor, and they were dying of starvation and malnutrition. There were no adults in the tent. The men were all standing around doing nothing. The women were scrounging around for pieces of plastic to make a little igloo-style refugee hut that you see in Africa. And the kids were just running wild. But the kids weren't getting enough food. We went to the head of the camp and we said, "Why are the children starving? Don't you have enough food to give assistance?" And he said, "We have enough food for 50,000. And there are only 49,200 in the camp. The food is not making its way down the chain to the children." Didn't understand this, and was explained that according to Somali culture and tradition, we give all of the food to the patriarch who's the head of a clan. A clan can be 800 or 1,200 people, and it was up to the patriarch of the clan to distribute the food. The men were getting enough food. The women were barely getting enough food, but they weren't giving the food to their children. Couldn't understand this, and was going around the camp, see another little single-engine plane fly and land on this dirt airstrip, and within 3 minutes, the men became really animated. They ran behind bushes. They were taking bales of stuff, throwing it on the back of the plane. Bales of stuff were coming off the plane. Plane lands and takes off within 3 minutes. And the men are taking the bales that came off the plane and running to hide it somewhere in the bushes. What they were putting on the plane was food. What was coming off the plane was khat. It's a hallucinogen. It's a drug that you sit and you chew, and you get high from chewing the khat. They were trading their children's food for the drugs. I couldn't get home quickly enough and hug my kids and say, "No, we're not going to be sending Jewish volunteer doctors and nurses to this refugee camp. We're going to outfit 3 mobile medical units, and we will outfit them, we'll give them enough equipment, enough medication for a 2-year period, and we'll deliver it from Mombasa to the refugee camps in Kenya, and we will train Somali doctors to run them." We spent our money in Israel. We put together these 3 mobile medical units, delivered them, trained the Somalis to run it, and left. It was the worst of human behavior that I have ever seen. The Joint works with Jewish communities and non-Jewish communities around the world. The story of Jewish communities, the greatest problem when you say, what's the biggest challenge that you have today? The challenge is fundraising. The challenge is taking care of 140,000 elderly Jews in the former Soviet Union. It's not a sexy thing to get money for. It's not like renewal of a Jewish community. It's not like a fundraising campaign for Operation Solomon to rescue Jews, to take care of 140,000 elderly Jews. Our rabbis teach us sayings, Kol Yehudi Arev Zel Hazeh. Every Jew is responsible for one another. Tikkun Olam, repair of the world. Or Lagoyim, a light unto the nations. This is what we get to do every day. And how do we do it? And what do we do? I'll tell you a story. A man in Belarus, before the Holocaust, a town called Dyatlovo in Belarus. 8,000 people, 6,000 were Jews before the Holocaust. The Nazis came into Dyatlovo. They immediately took the intelligentsia, the Jews, the Jewish leaders of the town, and murdered them on the outskirts of the town. They ghettoized Dyatlovo and forced all the Jews to live within a 3-block area. And a man named Avremel Kaplan dug a bunker for his family where they hid when the camp was exterminated in 1942. And he and his family then ran to the woods, and they were hiding in the woods for a 3-year period in Belarus, just as a family unit. By the time the Nazis were overthrown and the Red Army came in, Avremel left the woods with his family. The Russian army said, you're free to go wherever you want, to his sister and his brother and others. But you, Avremel, you're 19 years old. You're now coming into the Red Army. So they conscripted him into the Russian army when they let his sister and his mother leave and come to displaced persons camps and ultimately to the United States. Avremel went through his years of service in the Red Army, and in 1949 was released from his army service. And he said, I want to go be with my mother and my sister. To which they said, no, the Iron Curtain has fallen and you can't leave. So he went back home, and he became the only Jew to return to Dyatlovo, Belarus. He married a non-Jew, he had kids, he had a very small, nice life, living on a meager pension, and in his later years, the Joint delivered food packages to Avremel Kaplan. He lived in a house in rural Belarus that had no running water. He had to walk 2 blocks to get water from the well. And we would deliver a package every month to Avremel. And I would call him once a month, and in Yiddish we would speak, and I'd say, Avremel, Besmachsa, how are you? I'm okay, what do you need? I don't need anything. Someone from the Joint shows up every month and gives me a package, and that is enough with medications and food for me to get by. Until 4 years ago, when I called him, Avremel Vesmachsta, ich habe a große Grace mit dir in the Joint. I have a big problem with you and the Joint. Okay, what did I do? What's the problem? The problem is Malka Gittel. Okay, who or what is Malka Gittel? And he explains that Malka Gittel is a woman who was born here in Dyatlovo. She's 2 years younger than I am. She was raised here. We went to the same Jewish school when we were growing up. Her family moved to St. Petersburg, moved to Leningrad, which is now St. Petersburg, in 1938. And she lived in Leningrad and St. Petersburg until just a few years ago, and she decided she wanted to return home to be buried in the cemetery where her parents and grandparents and ancestors were. So now there are 2 Jews that live in Dyatlovo, Belarus, Avremel and Malka Gittel, both of them getting food packages from the Joint every month. And I call him, and so what's the problem? The problem is Malka Gittel and I got the same food package until this month. And this month, I got the same package, but you took the depends out of her package, and you took a few other items out of her package. Why did you do that? She's incontinent and she can't go outside without the Depends. And we have to walk 2 blocks to just get water, and we still have an outhouse that we have to go into. And in broken Yiddish, I had to explain that, Avremel, you're a Holocaust survivor. Malka Gittel, although she was born in the same town, and although she lived through the siege of Leningrad, which was a 900-day siege in which the Nazis had surrounded Leningrad, there was massive starvation in Leningrad. Her father died of starvation during the siege. Her mother died of typhus during the siege. She survived, and she was a teacher in Leningrad until the late 1990s, and then moved back to Dyatlovo. And I had to say, Avremel, she's not considered to be a Holocaust survivor. What do you mean? We both came from the same town. We're both Jews. We both lived through this horrendous atrocity. And she now lives in the same town. We're the only 2 Jews who are here. What do you mean she's not a Holocaust survivor? Avremel, there's something called the Conference of Material Claims Against Nazi Assets that gives the joint money to take care of Nazi survivors, to take care of Holocaust survivors. But according to the definition of who was a survivor and who is not, you're only considered a survivor if you were living in an area that was occupied by the Nazis. And because Leningrad was surrounded but never occupied, she's not considered to be a Holocaust survivor under the rules of the Claims Conference. So I had to explain to Avremel that we get money to take care of you and for your food packages from claims against the Nazis. We don't get any money for Malka Gittel. Now, out of 140,000 elderly in the former Soviet Union, half are considered to be Holocaust survivors and Nazi victims. Half are not. So we receive funds to take care of 70,000 elderly Jews and no funds to take care of another 70,000 Jews. So the case of Avremel and Malka Gittel multiply by 70,000, and that's the issue that we had to face. I had to go back to the board of directors of the Joint and say, what are you going to do about this? How can you give out an unequal share? Here's a case of just 2 that are living together. What are these numbers? How can we make sure that there's equal food packages for Jews in need? They have the same needs. And the board of JDC came back and said, we have to raise more funds. We have to be able to take care of Jews with dignity wherever they are, because this is the meaning of Jewish responsibility today. So that was done. And through the federation system and the Joint, funds are raised to take care of elderly Jews wherever they are. I tell you the story of Avremel Kaplan because he's my uncle. He's my mother's brother. And I spoke to him all the time, and it's just emblematic of what's taking place elsewhere. We went to, tell me, what would you do? What would you do if you got a call saying, okay, Cuba's open for business as Jews again, but the community hasn't come together, and we don't even know, there's only these, 6 or 8 Jews that show up. We have a census from the 1950s when there were 15,000. We have no idea how many are left or who they are or where they are. So what would you do? What we did was we went to Guadalajara, Mexico, and we took a conservative rabbi out of his synagogue in Guadalajara and sent him to Cuba. And we sent a community worker from Argentina to Cuba and got the first license for a doctor a Jewish doctor, Ted Myers, from Palo Alto, California, to go to Cuba. The three of them go, they see what's going on, they come back, and they give their report to the board of the Joint Distribution Committee. The rabbi, this community has lost it. They don't know Torah, Tefillah, Teshuvah, the things that we talk about on the high holy days. They haven't come together, and they don't have any knowledge or remembrance of this. We're going to have to start from A, B, C, from Aleph, Bet, in working with this community. And we're going to have to go knocking door to door from everyone that we knew from 1956 and invite them to come back. The community development worker, well, I don't know that we can do much. There's still, a communist block captain counting who's walking in and out of anybody's apartment or any synagogue. And the doctor comes back and says, good news and bad news. The good news, I wore a kippah throughout my time in Cuba. I met with the Minister of Health. I went to hospitals. I went to the medical schools. The good news, there is no anti-Semitism in Cuba. I talked to members of the community, and they're well respected. The bad news, there are no antibiotics in Cuba. And if you or your kids need ampicillin, penicillin, or anycillin, it's not available. So the best thing that we at the Joint can do, fill your suitcase with antibiotics, and the next time you go down to Cuba, give it to the Jewish community, and we'll set up a volunteer group of doctors and pharmacists from the community. The largest pharmacy in Havana, Cuba, is on the second floor of the Patronato, the Jewish synagogue in Havana. And through missions, and those of you who have gone to mission, and Lee, those who have come from the Houston Federation, have filled your suitcases with medications, brought it to Cuba, where it's distributed to any member of the Jewish community, and every Tuesday and Thursday the pharmacy is open to anyone that walks in with a prescription, regardless of religion, race, or creed. Neighbors of the Jewish community, throughout everyone that lives in the Vedado neighborhood, have come up to us and said, we're so grateful that there's a Jewish community here. Because there are Jews, and because your fellow Jews care and are still taking care of them, my children now have access to medicine that they wouldn't have any other way. We work with Jewish communities with whatever their needs are. And the needs are different in every country around the world. If you remember nothing else, remember that Cuban Jews are Cuban. Argentinian Jews are Argentinian. We are American Jews. We live like our neighbors. When the stock market goes up, our portfolio goes up. When it goes down, ours goes down. Jews, wherever they are, live within the local context. And the local context is different in every country around the world. So the needs of a Jewish community of 4,500 Jews in Morocco today are very different than the Jews in Hungary or in Poland, or the 5,000 Jews in India, or the 600 Jews that are in the Philippines, or Jews anywhere around the world, or a product of the overall social, political, and economic environment in which they live. When it said, the Joint, our mission, Kol Yehudi, Arev Zalazah, we're all responsible for one another. What does never again mean? Never again means having your eyes wide open, seeing what's going on around the world, being forewarned, taking care of your communities wherever they are, and providing whatever necessary assistance. In some cases, it's security. In the case of Morocco, if you go visit the Jewish community in Casablanca, it's unbelievable. They have a school and a courtyard. and the Jewish kids of the school in Morocco will all stand in the courtyard, and they'll sing Hatikva. And you stand in this courtyard that's surrounded by high-rise apartments with Muslim women totally covered, leaning over their balconies. Any one of them could throw a rock or take a shot down at the Jewish kids in this square. A lot of money has gone to security needs for Jewish communities around the world. Things are not predictable. I mean, I'm a political scientist by academic training, and when I was taking a course at Georgetown in 1976 with Henry Kissinger as a professor, we were studying something called Kremlinology, to study the former Soviet Union and see who was in power and et cetera. And what did it all boil down to? It all boiled down to taking a picture from the May Day parade in Moscow and saying, okay, we know Brezhnev is the chairman, and the guy standing to his right is probably number 2, and the one next to him is number 3, and on down the line. It's far from an exact science. No one 5 years ago would have predicted that Mohamed Bouazizi in Tunisia would have self-emulated himself and lit himself on fire, and that match would become the Arab Spring, and that within 6 months, Hosni Mubarak, the head of Egypt, would be overthrown, and within 2 years, Muammar Gaddafi would be killed by his own people. 2 years ago, nobody could have told you that there were Russian separatists who would be attacking Ukraine, and that Donetsk airport, which was an international airport built in 2009, would be bombed out to the degree that no planes can land in Donetsk, Ukraine any longer, and that 8,000 Jews who were living in that part of Ukraine would become living in a war zone, or that the Joint would have to set up volunteers from other parts of Ukraine to bring food and medicine into the Jewish communities that are living in besieged areas. Not predictable. Nobody knew this would take place. And there are repercussions for every global event on Jewish communities around the world. There are Jews that live in Morocco. There are Jews that live in Tunisia that were affected by the Arab Spring. There are 8,000 Jews living in the area that's under a war zone today in Ukraine. The vicissitudes of politics and the reality of what's taking place around the world becomes the reality for local Jewish communities wherever they are. I'll end with a couple of words, and then we can take questions, and I'd really like to interact with you and talk about communities or work that we're doing anywhere that's of interest to you. But the 2 words are words that I get every year on May 24th. Invariably, it's 5 in the morning and the phone rings and my wife breaks one of my ribs, hands me the receiver, and a girl gets on the other end and she says, Toda Rabbah, thank you very much, and then hands the phone to her father and we have a longer conversation. Her name is Tziona. Her birthday is on May 24th, 1991. She was the baby who was born on the plane, on the flight from Addis Ababa to Israel. And she calls me on her birthday every year, which is the same as the anniversary of the airlift, to say thank you. And she calls me because I was in Gondar, Ethiopia in the 1980s, and we helped move 30,000 Jews from their villages in the north to Addis Ababa to get them to safety so that they could get out. And I was the face interviewed on CBS and NBC the night of Operation Solomon to say this is taking place. But those are the words for you. Those are the words for this federation that it participated in the rescue of Ethiopian Jewelry, that participates in everything that we're doing around the world. And those are the words to this community and to each one of you that is part of Klal Yisrael, of Kol Yehudi Erev Zelazeh, that we all are responsible for one another. Last thing before I take questions. In addition to the work that we do with Jewish communities around the world, the Joint Distribution Committee is working with non-Jewish communities in more than 30 countries today. During times of disaster, earthquake in Haiti, typhoon in Philippines, tsunami in Indonesia, Sri Lanka, the Joint is there. And one of the first things that we do is we're in partnership with the Israel Defense Forces. How do you get in partnership with the Israel Defense Forces? What are you doing with them? Well, if you remember, it was exactly 5 years ago that the earthquake took place in Port-au-Prince, Haiti. And it was a massive, devastating earthquake, 9.2 on the Richter scale. Devastating to Haiti. The earthquake took place at 5:30 on a Monday afternoon. I called the Israeli Foreign Ministry to ask them if they were going to be sending anyone into Haiti to help with rebuilding and what was needed. And they said no, but the Israel Defense Forces was marshaling a team and a plane that was going to take off for Port-au-Prince within 24 hours. We called the Israeli general in charge of the operation and said, General Marin, do you have generators because there's no electricity in Port-au-Prince? And the answer was, yes, we have generators. We know we have to take care of this. And then it was, do you have special orthopedic equipment for crush victims? Because there are more than 3,000 people that needed amputations in Haiti. And the answer was, no, we don't have that special equipment. And then a question, do you have incubators for preemie babies? And the answer was, no, we don't have incubators. So the first $100,000 that we spent to assist the victims of the earthquake in Haiti, we spent in Israel, putting equipment and incubators onto the plane. Now, we heard reports that the tarmac, the landing strip in Haiti, had been damaged by the earthquake. And we called the Israeli team to say, the United States is telling us that no planes can land in Haiti. And they said, well, we already took off, and we're heading over there. But we're going to be able to land. And I said, how are you going to be able to land when nobody else can? And he said, because the Israeli ambassador to Haiti and Dominican Republic, it's the same ambassador, while he had his army service in Israel before he went into the foreign ministry, he was an air traffic controller. And he knows the exact distance of each one of his paces. And he walked down to the tarmac in Port-au-Prince, and he paced off the runway, and he called us, and he said, we have 20 extra meters to spare. So we're landing. It was the only plane that landed in Port-au-Prince, Haiti, for a 3-week period. The Israelis set up a mobile field clinic and hospital, and I'm sitting at my home in Tuxedo, New York, 72 hours after the earthquake, and I'm watching CNN, and there's Anderson Cooper in Haiti interviewing the Israeli general who's in charge of the operation, and asking him, why are you here, and how did you get here from Israel? And they said, there was a need. There was a human need. We had the ability to respond and help. We couldn't not be here. And then he turned to a Haitian gentleman and said, why are you here? And the guy stepped aside, and he said, because this is the only place in the country that has a working incubator. And my newborn son would not have survived delivery anywhere else in this country. And he stepped aside and pointed to his son in an incubator that the Joint put on the plane 72 hours earlier. And he said, we've named him Baby Israel after the country that helped give him life. There's a baby Israel in the Philippines, and there's a baby whose name is Ehud in Nepal, because that family decided they were going to name their son after the Israeli doctor that delivered him and not the country of Israel. So, again, I have the privilege, and the Joint has the privilege, of working with Jewish communities and working with non-Jewish communities in their hours of greatest need. And the words from Tziona are the same as the words from Esther, an elderly woman in Tbilisi, Georgia, who, when I was with her and I said, what's the message that I have to bring back to North America? It's thank you. Esther is a 94-year-old elderly woman who gets regular assistance and would not be able to survive without you and without us. So, on behalf of all of the communities that we work with, because it's not us, it's them, Toda Rabah, thank you very much.
So now an opportunity to ask questions. There are cards in many of your hands and some pencils, so please feel free to write down a question to ask our speaker. And I'll start by, what's the next, where's the next Cuba? So the next place that sort of looks like Jewish life is bleak with the 7 people in the basement, but that is also ripe for that renewal.
I don't think there is another Cuba. Renewal is really happening throughout Eastern Europe. I mean, that's the place. I mean, you know, I told the story of Cuba, but I could have easily told the story of Poland. And that when I started working with JDC, we thought there may be 1,000 Jews left in Poland, and that they were all leaving, and that there would not be more Jews in Poland. Community has completely come back, and it's again from the young people in the community that have attended Sarvash. And here's a story of a young Jew. I was in Minsk, Belarus in 1994, and a Jewish man opened his storefront to serve as a synagogue because the main synagogue had been closed in Minsk. And I went there for 3 days, and in the morning he had a minyan, he had a shacharit minyan in the storefront. And I was standing there with, you know, about 50 or 60 other Jewish people who came for services. And there was a kid who was about 14 who would come by and stick his head in and look in the window and see what's going on. First day I saw him stick his head in, and he left. Second day, same thing. The third day, he stuck his head in, and he asked one of the people, what's that thing that you're all wearing? And the guy said, it's a prayer shawl. And he explained to him what a prayer shawl was, and the Jewish people wear this when we daven. And the kid then left. He came back 15 minutes later with a little package. He unwrapped it, and it was a tallis. And he said, this was the runner on my grandmother's dining room table. And I saw each one of you people wearing it, and I noticed it because it had those strings hanging off the end, which other tablecloths don't have. And he said, but we're not Jewish, so I don't know what this is about. He then went home, he brought his grandparents and his parents back to the storefront, and they outed themselves. And they said, yeah, we are Jewish. We didn't want Y Evreysky stamped on your internal Soviet passport. So we never told you you were a Jew, and we never affiliated anyway. He, his grandparents, and his parents all made Aliyah to Israel within 6 months after discovering that he was a Jew.
Wow. Several questions about Argentina and the Argentinian Jewish community. So if you'll help us with that.
So Argentina as a country has completely rebounded from the economic collapse that it had faced. You know there's been anti-Semitism historically in Argentina. Many of you know that many Nazis had refuge in Argentina, and there's a part called Bariloche near Patagonia, which still has significant German and even Nazi influence there. You may recall that there was a bombing of the Amia building, which is the Jewish, like a community center, in 1994. And there was a bombing of the Israeli embassy in Buenos Aires in 1992. The bombing of the Amia building killed 86 Jews. The perpetrators of that bombing never brought to justice. There was never a trial. And there was recently the case of Alberto Nisman, who was a lawyer who was investigating the bombings in Argentina. And he was about to come out with a report that showed government complicity in what had taken place. And he was found dead in his apartment about 4 or 5 months ago, the day before the report was to come out. So there has not been justice for the bombing of Jews in Argentina. Jewish community in Argentina feels safe. They feel secure. There's now 240,000 Jews in Argentina. As Lee told you, or as was mentioned earlier, you helped open a Jewish senior citizens home, which is the class of the way a senior citizens home should be operated and work. So Argentina is completely rebounded. And there's a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi, Sergio Bergman, who is now a member of the new government. There was a new government, a new president elected just 2 months ago, and Rabbi Bergman is a member of parliament.
So there's a question about terrible conditions and the murders of civilians in Syria, asking if the Joint's going to be helping or how the Joint is helping. And I think the larger question is, how is it decided which crises get sort of the support and attention of the Joint and of our community support?
So the second part of the question first. It's not an exact science. If there's a crisis of significant magnitude, and I hate to say it like this, but if there's significant deaths, if there's significant loss of property and destruction, refugees, we look to open a mailbox, which is going to Jews throughout America and saying, look, we don't quite have enough for the Jewish part of our portfolio. We don't have enough to take care of all of the Jewish needs around the world. So if you're interested in the victims of the earthquake in Haiti, or if you're interested in the Syrian refugee situation, we do something called opening a mailbox, in which we go to communities throughout North America and say, if you want to donate to the Syrian refugee victims, you can send your money to the Joint or to the Jewish Coalition for Disaster Relief, which is a coalition of 50 national organizations. So in Syria with Syrian refugees, there's a Jewish Coalition for Syrian Refugees. It has raised a little over $2 million to date. It has programmed $1.6 million thus far. And where does that money go? There are a group of Israeli organizations, a group called IsRaid, another group called the Israel Trauma Coalition, another called Center for Immigrants and Migration to Israel, who have all received grants to work with and take care of Syrian refugees. So IsRaid is running a clinic in Lesbos, Greece, taking care of refugees that are coming through Greece. There are programs in Hungary and elsewhere. And the distinction is Everywhere that we work or the coalition work, it's known that these are Jews. And Israel has a big Magen David outside of its tent, and Syrian Muslim refugees coming onto shore in Lesbos, Greece, see the Israeli Magen David at the only clinic that's there, and have become friends.
It looks like at least somebody, if not many more, in the community tonight who are planning to go to Cuba, and they want to know how to access medications to take with them. So what is that process to get hold of those precious medicines to take?
Simple answer. The Joint receives a list every month from the pharmacists and from the community in Cuba of what the outstanding needs are. So if you contact my office, we will send you the latest list of what is needed, and then whatever...
Well, I think that was the question. And then how are people able to bring a suitcase full of medication? Is it that they're physicians and they have samples or access to it? Is there a place where people can, most of the time you can't get a medication unless it's written...
It's been a combination of a lot of things, from doctors' offices that have made medications available, from some people who have access to different things.
Do we have a helper voice? Suzanne, will you stand up? It'll just be a little bit easier for people to... Talk to us about some of your partners. You talked about recruiting volunteers. Specifically, there's a question about, do you work with Chabad and their services to communities and other organizations? So what are some of the names who are really some of your heavy lifters in these places where Jews are needing help and support?
With respect to Jewish partnerships, we partner with anyone and everyone that's out there willing to assist. So we work with Chabad, we work with the Reform Movement, we work, I remember coming back from the former Soviet Union in 1989 and having a meeting with Alex Schindler, who was then the director of HUC, and with Jerry Epstein, the head of the conservative movement, and with Rabbi Lookstein, who was the head of the Orthodox movement. And we went to each one and said, look, Soviet Union is collapsing. There's an opportunity to reclaim Jewish lives and help guide Jewish life in the former Soviet Union. Would you be willing to send rabbinical students and others to the former Soviet Union to work? We work with Chabad. We work closely with Chabad wherever they are. There's no difficulty. We're a pluralistic Jewish organization and bring pluralism to anything and everything we do. And in the case of Argentina, when the communities turned to the Joint and said, we need assistance to stay open, I remember sitting at a table where every rabbi of Buenos Aires came to a meeting to talk about what it's going to take to keep the community going. And I was sitting next to Rabbi Grunblatt, who was the head of Chabad in Buenos Aires. And he leaned over to me and he said, I've never sat at this table with those other rabbis before, but because of the Joint and because we see you as an honest broker in the Jewish world, we're willing to sit and participate at the same table.
Just a couple more questions, and then we'll go enjoy dessert together. So there's a question about France, and so it was making me think, what are communities that you're watching really closely because there's a anticipation or fear that they're going to need, either the rescuing or support, or the communities are going to need help. So what's sort of the palpable concern at this point for you?
Palpable concern are more places like Morocco and Tunisia than France.
Okay.
Look, we all know about Charlie Hebdo. We know about the Recant attack in France. We know about rising anti-Semitism in France. We know about terrorism that's coming to Brussels and France and Scandinavia and elsewhere. The French Jewish community is French. That's their culture, that's their background, that's who they are, for better or for worse. They have their own organization, they have their federation, it's called the CRIF. They take care of one another, they're fully integrated with other outside organizations. And French Jewry, there is fear in France within the Jewish community, tremendous fear. And Prime Minister Netanyahu, after the last attack, said, French Jews, the future is in Israel. There may not be a future for Jews in France. That's not what we hear from the French Jewish community. From the French Jewish community, they are staying put, even though Aliyah is triple the numbers that it was before. And if you go to Herzliya Pituach outside of Tel Aviv, come there in August, if you don't speak French, you don't get along too well. So many of the wealthy French Jews take their yachts to Israel, have a place in Israel just in case it gets too hot, but have one foot in. There are about 500,000 Jews that live in France. And even if 10% of that community were to get up and say, we want to leave and make Aliyah because we're afraid, you're still going to have 450,000 Jews living in France. So they live with the reality of increased security. And the government, since the last attack, has had police stationed outside of every synagogue, every Jewish school, every JCC on a daily 24/7 basis.
So, final question that will happen here, and I know at our reception that's graciously sponsored by the Sisterhood of Congregation Emmanuel, that'll be in our Ashman multipurpose room. You'll have an opportunity to interact with our speaker this evening. So the final question is really, I think, it asks about resources. So is there a book that's detailing the projects that you've spoken about, or things that you haven't mentioned? Because I think we find the stories, the way that you share them with us, inspiring for the successes and the challenges and for the work that we have cut out ahead of us around the world that we know sadly is going to continue to be so necessary. What resources, either from JDC or from that can we be looking to inform our friends, our neighbors, and to continue to have our eyes and ears open?
The JDC has been called the best kept secret in the Jewish world for many, many years. The reason that we were called a secret was because my former boss said we were big, fat, and happy. Anytime we needed anything, we would turn to the Federation system and say, Lee, there's a crisis in Argentina. Help us raise the money to do this. There's a crisis here. And so that has been the funding stream, the main funding stream for the projects that we do. We have now developed a marketing and communications team that regularly puts out updates on the projects and programs that we're involved with. It's public. We need to do a better job at getting the message out. But again, through Lee and through the Federation, you can get all of the latest information on what the organization is doing.
Well, please join me again in thanking our presenters.
Thank you. Thank you.
And again, we cannot thank enough the Bondic Center, Jewish Federation of Greater Houston for being our partners to help keep us plugged into the needs of our community and making the world a better place. We look forward to having dessert together. Please join us.
Thank you.
If you will follow.